David, thanks for being at Experience Week. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, it's nice to be here.
I'd love to, if you could tell us what exactly one does at IDEO, in plain English, if you can.
Sure. Well, IDEO is a design and innovation consultancy. And unlike, I think, most people's perception of design, which is making things look beautiful and making things usable, at IDEO we think about design as a way of looking at the world and a way of solving problems, which is putting the needs of people first. At IDEO, I work in our business design practice, which is helping come up with equally innovative business models and ways of getting things to market as the products and services themselves. So if we're creating something new for a new market, why should we rely on old ways of delivering goods and services and even thinking about revenue models? Those can be designed too.
Sounds like a good gig. If you were telling your kindergartner how she could get to where you are, what would you tell her?
Focus on liberal arts. Think about education across a wide variety of spectrums. I'm a huge supporter of STEM education, but I also think that it shouldn't come at the expense of social sciences. A lot of what we do here at IDEO in terms of understanding the needs of people relies heavily on social sciences and an understanding of what the human condition is all about. And so I would encourage my kids, and do encourage my kids, to be broadly interested and not just narrowly interested.
Awesome. Well, we care a lot at Qualtrics about product experience, and by that we mean the thinking that goes into and the research that goes into building great products and building great services, and how you research that, how you come about it. You have some great ideas about who to talk to when it's time to form a new venture or find a new idea. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things that makes us special here at IDEO is our research capability. We have an entire group called Design Research, which is made up of sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists who really deeply try to understand the needs of people. But what we find is that when we're looking to do something different, where most companies start is typically the last place we would choose to look. So most companies, if you look at a normal distribution of where their users are, they'll go to the heart of the normal distribution and try to find the people that they feel like are in their target market. And those are great people to speak to when you're trying to validate a solution that you might already be familiar with. But if you're trying to come up with a new solution, there's usually not a ton of interesting stuff to be learned by speaking to the people who are using your products and services exactly like you expect. So where we tend to start our research is at the edges, at the edges of the normal distribution. People that are using things to the point where they break, or heavy users of objects. And at the other end, novices, maybe people that have been intimidated to try using something in the first place. What can we learn from those groups that might help us come up with ideas that might serve the core?
Okay. So it sounds like you probably at least try to get off the beaten track to find people like this. Can you give us some examples of maybe the most interesting places you've gone in search of outliers?
Yeah, I mean, every project is a little different, and what may seem a little ridiculous on some projects may not be so ridiculous on other projects. But one example that immediately comes to mind is a product design project we were doing for an insurance company who was trying to get people to think about how they might go about insuring their lives, which includes homeowners insurance and renters insurance. And what we found in our research is that people always underestimate the amount of stuff they have. Like, you might think you've got $20,000 worth of stuff when you actually have $50,000 worth of stuff. How do people have that disconnect in their brains? And who might we look at to help us come up with new ideas that might serve the entire spectrum of people? So when we looked at extremes, the two groups we chose to look at early in that project were hoarders, people who cherish every object they own and build massive stockpiles of stuff in their basement. What can you learn from those people about the value of objects and even estimating how much stuff they actually have? And similarly, looking at people that are total minimalists, people that live in like super small houses or apartments where they keep almost nothing. If you think about like George Clooney and Up in the Air, people that live with the minimum possible. When you explore those two extremes, you can start to think about people's different perceptions of how they value goods.
Sure.
And it's both a monetary value, but also an emotional value, and how those play out in goods and services.
So how do you find hoarders? Did you go to Craigslist? I mean, what's the...
So it's funny, we actually go to Craigslist a surprising amount. Now the key with Craigslist is you have to screen people really carefully, but there's a really famous story in IDEO design research lore about developing more comfortable shoes for women. And in order to think about who we would access to learn about how people deal with uncomfortable shoes when they have to be on their feet all day, we actually sent out a request to speak to dominatrixes.
Okay.
And it's shocking how many, maybe it's not shocking, how many dominatrixes actually advertise their services in places like Craigslist because they wear uncomfortable clothes for long periods of time. And that is an example of a total extreme user. So Craigslist can be a great resource when thoughtfully considered.
Sure.
But we use professional recruiters a lot. We use services that help us find people in some particularly specialized situations.
Well, what about some other examples? So for travel or for stuff, it's minimalists versus hoarders.
Yeah.
Give me some ideas of some of the other spectra you work on. Maybe a total novice user over here and a total expert on the other side.
We were doing a project for a medical device company not so long ago who makes an intraoperative imaging technology. And we were trying to create a better user experience for their technicians, a better UI, UX experience so they could work in the procedure more facilely and more comfortably. The bias of the hospitals and the bias of the company was that we should be speaking to expert users to learn how people optimize the technology for every possible situation. And we can learn a lot from people that are experts and black belts and doing every little using every possible feature and every possible facet of the technology. But what we found is that there was a ton more to learn on usability from the brand new technicians. So people that had been on the job for a day or two. You learn about what their struggles are. You learn about how they go about trying to solve their own questions and answer their own questions. And what we found was by looking at both novices as well as really experienced users, we got a better perspective on how to create technology that enabled newcomers to hit the ground running while still giving the performance required for more experienced personnel.
Well, it's a fascinating idea, and I think most product or user experience designers can relate to this, but it's one thing to be at IDEO where it's expected that you go out and find these fringe cases. It's probably another thing to be at a regular company where you like this idea, but how do you get started?
Yeah, we find it's a little bit difficult to get people to understand the power of it. But what we believe, and what I've seen time and time again here at IDEO, but also my work in the venture space, is that typically when companies are developing something new, early on, before they've developed any intellectual property, what they own is knowledge about people that other people don't have. They know something about their users that other people don't know. And in order to find something that is truly a revolutionary change and not an incremental change, you need to look in non-traditional places. Because if you're only relying on traditional ways of finding out insights, you're probably going to come up with the same insights that your competitors do.
Sure.
If you look in new places, you're bound to find new things.
Awesome. There's a famous idea, or it seems famous to me at IDEO, about feasibility, viability, and
Desirability.
Desirability, thank you. You've got an interesting perspective. I think IDEO has an interesting perspective on where to start. Can you explain those concepts briefly and then talk about where you start and why?
Sure. So if you imagine a Venn diagram that has 3 circles, we view that the best businesses are built at the intersection of desirability, which understands the needs of humans, viability, which understands the needs of the business, and feasibility, which understands the requirements of the technology. What we find is that companies tend to start with their assets first, more often than not. So they start with a piece of technology and then go hunting for a problem for it to solve. We find that more interesting solutions tend to show up when we start by looking at the needs of people before the need of technology or the importance of technology. Technology will always follow suit, but uncovering those latent human needs is often trickier than people give it credit for.
So I think conceptually, it's easier for people to understand or to agree with. You start with the desirability and you go from there. But it's not always the easiest thing to actually do. So how do you instill in that something like that into your admittedly very smart MBA students?
It's a good question, and what I find with my MBA students at Kellogg, and I think just generally what I find with entrepreneurs, whether they're in MBA programs or not, is they're in a rush to get to the viability and feasibility of their idea. They've already assumed they know and deeply understand the problem they're solving. What I try to help them do in my courses, and what I think we do a pretty effective job of at Kellogg, is getting them to unpack their assumptions about the problem they're solving early. And the nice thing about qualitative research and getting them to go out and push those assumptions about more deeply understanding the emotional and social needs of their customers, and not just the functional needs, they can see feedback on that relatively quickly, and it doesn't take much to convince them that it's a valuable place to look.
Sure.
But getting them to take that first leap often requires a little bit of careful prodding.
Yeah. So where do you send your students? Yeah, you encourage them to do this. You encourage them to get out of the building.
Yeah.
Can you give me some examples of where your students have gone in search of those
Sure.
ideas?
I mean, fortunately, Kellogg is quite close to the city of Chicago. And so Chicago being a pretty diverse ecosystem, there's a ton of interesting places for them to research right in their hometown. And I think once they take the leap and actually get off campus and get into the city, there's no shortage of places for them to research, even just walking into stores, restaurants, buildings, ideally people's homes, apartments, but there's plenty of places. It becomes a little trickier when you're located outside of an urban area or remote from the people that you're ultimately trying to serve. That's a little bit more of a challenge.
Yeah. So you've talked a lot about analogous thinking, you know, the idea of taking a question that you're struggling with and going away from what the obvious answers and the obvious sources would be. Can you give me some more examples of that, of cases either personally that you've done or that IDEO has done?
Sure, I can give you a couple. There was a series of projects we did for a large beef company here in the Chicago studio. It's a fascinating set of projects with a really amazing client. And one of the challenges that we were faced with helping them solve was, how do you get people to think about the beef on their plate as more than just a commodity? Because this particular product was extraordinarily special. It was made in a very careful way with an amazing provenance and story behind it. But when it shows up on a diner's plate at a restaurant, how does that magic translate all the way to the dining experience?
Sure.
And so we looked outside of the industry, outside of beef, outside of protein in general, to think about what other commodity products do people hold up to a different set of emotional esteem that may still be in a dining experience. And if you look at things like wine, these are products that are effectively commodities, but the stories that producers have about terroir and where the wine is from and the subtleties of the flavor, all of that applies to beef, it applies to chicken, it applies to other things we eat. How come we don't borrow some of those insights about telling the story of a product through things like tasting notes, like we do with wine? How come that doesn't extend to other parts of the plate? And in this one particular example, simply by telling that story with tasting notes and calling out the preciousness of the product, the company was able to charge, in some cases, 4 or 5 times the price they had originally planned on charging, because people all of a sudden understood how precious that product was. It also, funny enough, in those situations, the product was no longer competing with other steaks on the menu. All of a sudden, in the consumer's mind, it was competing with a bottle of wine that they might choose to impress their client or show someone on the other side of the table that they care. Here is another way of showing that I have a sophisticated palate and that I care about you sitting across the table from me. So let me select this particular item for you, much like I might select a $250 or $300 bottle of wine.
Sure. Well, it sounds like a fun project to work on, as long as you're not a vegetarian, right?
As long as you're not a vegetarian, even if you are, it's extreme. But what we find is that products and services do emotional jobs for us. And oftentimes, entrepreneurs and many of our clients think about the functional jobs of products first. But how would you have ever known that steak does an emotional job for you as a diner until you start looking outside of your own industry for where else people take something ordinary and it becomes extraordinary by understanding both the social and psychographic and emotional needs it does for people.
Yeah. So we've seen the rise of the experience economy, and companies that do a good job latching on to an experience and then optimizing it are succeeding. And so you've seen traditional industries like transportation, lodging, hospitality, even e-commerce have been changed immensely by companies that bring a new experience to the table. What are some other industries, either now or in the near future, that you think are viable or liable to be disrupted by experiences?
2 industries in which I see experience being absolutely crucial and will continue to be crucial are places that I spend a lot of my time. Number 1, in healthcare, and particularly as experience is being compensated differently. Good experiences are being compensated differently than bad experiences. That is a very pressing and prevalent need for hospitals, clinics, and medical services providers.
Sure.
The second is education, and as technology becomes more broadly distributed and as telepresence and other types of experience consumption become more widely accessible, the way we teach has to change. I can no longer, in good conscience, deliver content in a classroom where I know they can get the same content outside of the classroom by attending a free MOOC.
Sure.
So I have to change what the classroom experience is like for my students to give them something they can't get anywhere else. And I imagine that will continue to be the case where lecture type content will continue to be consumed outside of the classroom, and hands-on, sleeve rolling, workshop, custom, personalized, individual experiences for students will become more the norm inside of the four walls of a university.
Yeah. Let me double back to your response about medical, or the medicine in general, being responsive to the experiences that people have. Who would you call out as having done a good job of following this experience and actually being responsive to the outcomes, the patient outcomes?
I mean, I think there are the classic examples. The one in particular that comes to mind is the Mayo Clinic, not only in terms of the way that they deliver care and the team-based approach to delivering care, but the role that technology plays in that care delivery. I think they're a wonderful example. I also think there are many companies currently who deal with chronic disease management that are beginning to take into account the entire patient experience and not just the moment where their product is being used for some specific function. So we do a lot of work in the diabetes space.
Sure.
And in one particular example, we're working with a medical device company who is thinking about the broader patient experience around managing their diabetes, and not just the moment that this particular company's device might be used. So how do you help manage the psychological elements of that disease, the social elements of that disease, the behavioral elements of that disease? Because for the patient, it's one disease and one experience.
Sure.
As the provider, we need to make sure that we are integrating into the patient's life versus asking them to integrate into our experience.
So to get a good patient experience, of course, you need to measure that and you need to get feedback. Can you give me some examples that you've seen of companies capturing that feedback in the moment instead of as an afterthought or a bolt-on part of their experience?
Yeah. One thing that we try to practice, particularly around experience-heavy products and services, where that's going to be a key differentiator, we try to take advantage of co-design opportunities whenever we can. So actually engaging the patients or the clinicians or the students or the faculty in the design process itself. It's one thing to put something out in the world and say, what do you think of this? It's a totally different experience to have them sit down with a marker or with some foam core and have them develop the concept alongside of you. There's a sense of responsibility and ownership and intimacy that comes from that. That's different than just looking at a panel of options and selecting your favorite.
Yeah. Put your consumer and your designer hat on, and tell me about a product experience that you've had that really bolstered your view of the company. Something either unheralded or unexpected that a company did that really leveled them up.
So I might answer this question a little bit differently than you've asked it, because sometimes I find the worst experiences and the best experiences can happen from the same experience.
Sure, okay.
And what I find is the recovery often completely overshadows the original experience that may have been bad. Recently, and this may shock a lot of people, a really good experience I had was on United Airlines. I was on a flight recently where the internet service was a little bit shaky and it was kind of going on and going off, and I flagged down a flight attendant and asked her whether or not they were experiencing problem with the internet, and she said that they were going to reboot it, and they rebooted it, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But when I landed, as soon as I landed at my destination, which was like 45 minutes later, there was an email in my inbox from United saying, sorry about the inconvenience, here's an additional X amount of miles for the problem. So they had preempted, I was never going to write an email, I was never going to create a stink about it, but they had preempted what they thought might be an inconvenience for me by offering me something of value, which I thought was an unbelievable way to take an historically reactive industry and make it proactive. And so even though that experience was not going to be an end-all be-all bad experience, the airline industry is riddled with experiences when people are at like their emotional wit's end or they're under pressure to be a certain place at a certain time. But I thought it was really thoughtful that United thought at this moment, hey, I don't know if this is a problem, but we're going to give you something in advance just to recognize or to show you that we recognize that it may have been an inconvenience.
Yeah.
There's a much longer example of an experience I had at a Hyatt hotel that was quite similar to, where I had a bad experience in a hotel room, and the way they recovered the next day made me want to recommend that hotel to anybody who was traveling to Washington, D.C. And that was 10 years ago, I still recommend that hotel based on the recovery and how thoughtful and how human-centered it was.
Well, it's a good reminder that we talk about product design, but service design is just as important, and that's what people remember.
Well, and frankly, most products are technology-enabled services. And most people, when they think about business, they think we're either a product company or a service company. I think we here at IDEO, but more broadly, a lot of entrepreneurs are starting to recognize that products are basically services that can happen at scale. And so if you think about a product as a service, all of a sudden how you infuse some humanity into it or additional humanity into it becomes a more fruitful area for innovation.
Sure, and one of the few ways to, in a commoditized world, one of the few ways to differentiate.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about a product that you own, and it's one that you love, one maybe that you'll pass on to your kids. What is it about that product experience or that item that really resonates, that has an emotional connection?
I have a set of 1958 Slingerland drums that were my father's drums in high school. And it was the first drum kit I ever learned how to play music on. And it is as much of a piece of art in my mind as it is an instrument, but maybe more important, it is like the physical representation of so much memory, both for him every time he comes to my house and me every time I sit down at the drum kit. And now I've got kids who are old enough to make noise, not music, but seeing them sit at this same set of drums and the longevity that those drums have had and the craftsmanship behind them. I love the idea that those will continue to be in our family for generations to come, but I also love the idea that crafted products embody stories. They are like physical artifacts of experiences where every time you look at it, it conjures emotion.
Sure.
And so I view them as much more than a physical object on which to play music. I view them as like a family heirloom, much like a dining room table or much like a piece of art where there's a lot of family history embodied in it. So that's probably my favorite.
No, that's great.
And by the way, knowing that that is how people view products and services, like how might we design products that allow people to imbibe their own meaning and stories into them? More often than not, companies make an effort to tell you what stories you should be telling about the products they're selling you. But sometimes the most personal products and services come when you get to put your own stamp on it and your own interpretation to make it yours instead of a brand's.
Yeah, well, and a product has to last long enough to capture nostalgia.
Ideally, we'll see how my 7-year-old does with the drums.
Yeah, well, they survived you.
So far,
so maybe there's another generation in them. You teach a lot of MBA students who are eager to get out and build new experiences, new products. What are some of the trends that you see about the experiences or the products that they want to build? What's everybody interested in right now?
So a couple of trends that I've noticed with my students in recent years are, number one, the emphasis on hyper-personalization. People are no longer satisfied with having something that many people are using or the same experience that many people are having. They want it to be highly customized and highly tailored and highly individualized. So this trend towards really hyper-personal experiences and services is something I see quite a bit of. The other trend that I see, which delights me, is the importance of doing well while also doing good.
Sure.
And that social impact should be considered alongside economic impact. And so the problems that many of my students are solving are no longer problems about how to order faster in restaurants or how to buy a certain pair of jeans online. It's how to help people age in their homes longer, how to help people in rapidly developing markets have access to goods and services they might not otherwise have. So they're really deeply meaningful and impact-driven missions that they're on and not just economic missions.
Sure. So we live in a wonderful time, of course, and there's new things all the time.
Yeah.
But what's an experience that's out there that you can see on the horizon, but you can't wait to experience?
So I've thought a lot about this, and I think my answer overwhelmingly has to be precision and personalized medicine. We live in a world right now where it's one to many in terms of having an idea about how to treat a particular disease. And as we learn more about people's genomics and their microbiome and what makes them an individual, the ways in which we treat them can be highly personalized. So if you're prescribing a cancer therapeutic to a certain patient with a certain mutation, you might prescribe a very different regimen than somebody who has a different mutation or lives in a different environment. As we understand people at that cellular and genomic level, I imagine the outcomes in healthcare are going to be beyond anything that we can imagine right now, which is a time I look forward to.
So what are some examples of intermediate steps that people are taking today?
Yeah. In order for that possibility to become a reality, there's a bunch of things that need to happen. Number one, people's access to sequence their own genome needs to be more readily available. So right now it might cost thousands of dollars. There will come a time where sequencing your genome will cost $50. Mm-hmm. And so making that accessible to everyone is an important first step. And there are companies that are doing this very thing right now or on that mission right now. Similarly, understanding how to create specialized diagnostics and specialized pharmaceuticals. We see that happening right now in oncology. We see that happening right now in some rare disease areas. I think that those are the edges, mm-hmm. the means, and also the way in which we can develop solutions once those diagnostics are in place. As more and more people understand themselves genomically, as they understand their microbiome, and as we understand more about what might be possible in terms of customized therapeutics, this world is going to be a very different place.
Sure. So you gave some good examples of the boundaries of science and what we're pushing toward, but what are some examples of using, product experience design or just design to make good things more accessible to everyone?
That's a huge part of what design can be powerful for, is taking something that might exist in a small situation and make it more broadly accessible to a larger community. We do a lot of work here at IDEO in developing markets around the world, and there's this myth, I think, amongst people that look at creatives and designers and say, they thrive in unencumbered situations. They love to have wide open spaces and blue sky and all of these terms that you hear when it comes to creative thinking. The truth is that designers thrive off of constraint. And a lot of our work in developing economies comes from having very clear constraints where we need to develop something for under a certain amount of money with a very defined list of criteria that it needs to adhere to. One example of some work we did here in the Chicago studio was for farmers in Ethiopia, where the main staple crop in Ethiopia is a seed called teff. And the challenge that Ethiopian farmers have is that the dirt and the soil that they plant teff in is very laden with clay, and it's very dense and it's hard to work with. And the traditional way in which Ethiopian farmers plant the seed is by pushing a plow either with an ox or via human power through this clay, and then in this trench throwing seed by hand, which results in pretty poor crop yields because crops that grow in clusters are not particularly advantageous. So what we helped them do was create a product that allows them to row plant teff either by human power or by ox power, but we were very clear to adhere to the constraints that whatever parts it had needed to be locally accessible in Ethiopia. If it broke down, it couldn't be complicated enough that the farmer themselves couldn't fix it themselves. And so given those constraints, we came up with a really interesting design that's actually out on our deck if you want to take a look at it later. But given those constraints, it actually fueled a ton of ingenuity that I don't think we would have had were we unconstrained to begin with.
Awesome. Well, great insights into the possibilities and the future of product experience. David, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ben. It was fun to be here.